Good evening. Very nice to be back in York, and my second gig in a week with Nandini Das, who's exactly the sort of scholar that we all want to be when we grow up. I still have high hopes myself. There's a wonderful Sanskrit word, sangam, which means confluence. And Nandini is a confluence in two senses. One, she's a confluence between the worlds of literature and the study of literature and a historian, two rival departments, which she's now invading the history department at Oxford from her redoubt in the literature department. But also, obviously, she's someone who grew up in India and knows her Indian history and literature, but is by training and by scholarship a scholar of English literature. And that's not just an introduction to her life, it's very much the trajectory which has guided her scholarship. And she has provided an extraordinary bridge or confluence between the very different worlds of Mughal India and Tudor and Stuart England. Now, in this country, when we study the Tudors, well, particularly the Tudors and the Stuarts at school, we tend to get an incredibly parochial vision from the syllabus of their concerns and their lifestyles and their politics. Central, obviously, is the endless story that every generation of kids learns over and above everything else. The wives of Henry VIII, which provide endless generations with bad examples of marital relations. Nandini's vision of the Tudor and Stuarts is a revelation to anybody that's come to them via the GCSE or the O-level curriculums, as most of us have done in this country. And she portrays an incredibly cosmopolitan, European, but also global world, where a whole variety of figures appear popping up in the most improbable circumstances. The book she has just written, This Little World, A New History of Tudor and Stuart England, is quite unlike any other history of Tudor and Stuart England ever written. And anyone who expects to find the normal range of subjects will be pleasantly surprised by its replacement by a whole load of much more exotic and much more exciting worlds, which, and I loved this book. I loved its predecessor, her biography of Thomas Roe, which again brought these two worlds together with new insights into both. But in this one, she's come up with an extraordinary rogues gallery, like a sort of selection of Hilliard miniatures, but with completely improbable backgrounds. So what was it that led you to this book after the success of Thomas Roe? Was it, I mean, some of them I know that some of the figures in it you've written about before, yes, in essay form or as documentaries, or, but how did this form come together? How did this book get its incredibly granular and detailed form?
Out of the same obsession, I think, in some ways. So, like most people, my first kind of acquaintance with Tudor history was, again, through the image of its kings and queens, Henry VIII squaring up like a boxer, daring you to fight him, in his great Holbein portrait, or Elizabeth towering like a goddess over a map of England, and all of that. But I've always been interested in stories of cross-cultural encounter that just hovered on the margin. So even if you look at that great Holbein portrait of Henry VIII, he stands on a Turkish carpet. He has oriental pearls kind on him. We know from his accounts that he loved importing spectacles, glasses for his eyes as he grew older in multi-packs of 10 from Germany. So he is very much a global figure in that sense. And I wanted to think a little bit more about it. But the other thing that drove this story was also really questioning some of the basic ideas that we tend to take for granted. So that very sense that Tudor England is that this almost mythical, original idea of Englishness and England as an island nation. But if you prod a little bit even, that surface, that very glossy surface, you realize that England wasn't an island nation. It shared its space with multiple other nations, even within that archipelago that it occupies. And in fact, it wasn't quite sure whether it was a nation at all and what being a nation meant. So partly it was my kind of own curiosity to figure out where that idea of Englishness and England began. And to do that in this book, I do that through that wonderful rogues gallery of people moving in and out of the country, because that's when you realize that that idea of Englishness that we tend to take for granted, that it was perhaps a central core idea that radiates outwards, wasn't really the case. It evolves through conversation with other places, other people.
Now, in a sense, the least exotic of your many spectacularly exotic characters and portraits is Lavinia Teerlinck, a Flemish miniaturist who opens up very early, appears very early in your book.
Yeah.
Should we start with her? Because she's mildly exotic compared to some of the more wild examples that we come to later in the book.
She is, indeed. She's also pretty much invisible. So maybe it is fair to start with her. So Lavinia Teerlinck is a Flemish woman artist from Bruges. She grows up in Bruges and moves to England in her early 20s. Not very well known at all, despite the fact that she follows hard on the heels of people like Holbein. She arrives in England just after Holbein dies.
And is England bringing these people in because there simply aren't good painters in England, or is it that this is a place of opportunity where talented painters come to?
It's both. It's both. In the sense that we tend to forget that the Tudor dynasty is pretty new at this point. They're fairly new, and if Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, knew anything, it was the fact that he needed good PR, to put it very bluntly. He needed to establish this dynasty. And one way of doing that...
After the Wars of the Roses.
After the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah.
So he stage manages, he goes to the length of stage managing his eldest son Arthur's birth in Winchester. So it's
and the name he gives him.
And the name he gives him. So he's very keen on this sense of how the public perceive the Tudors, and one way of doing that in days before our kind of familiar media is through art and architecture. So he gets all of these foreign artists in, and Lavinia Teerlinck is one of them. In fact, she's the only foreign artist, only artist to be employed by 4 Tudor monarchs. Henry VIII, Edward, Mary, and then Elizabeth I. So she has this huge span of work. And despite that, we cannot confidently ascribe a single piece of artwork to her.
You know what? Not one?
No.
Really?
I mean, it's fascinating. If you look at some of the collections scattered across the world, there are multiple images where people say, possibly ascribed to Teerlinck. She's believed to have possibly trained the greatest English miniaturist, Nicholas Hilliard. And we know that she must have produced a huge amount of work. She was deemed important enough to be paid £40 a year.
Significantly, the oldest English portrait of someone who's not in the royal family is painted. First, oldest English portrait, is an English ambassador to the Flemish court,
Yeah.
Grimston,
Yeah.
which sits a tiny little thing with a wonderful turban on his head, Flemish turban,
Yeah.
in the National Gallery.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, non-aristocratic portraits are really rare anyway, but even within royal portraits, for instance, one of the things I figured out while I was working on Lavinia Teerlinck is how often she's commissioned perhaps through her husband, because as a woman, you didn't take commissions yourself. So your payment would be made to your husband. So sometimes those traces are lost. But what fascinated me about Teerlinck was not only that this 20-something young woman arrives in England and makes her space here, makes Tudor history. Like all of these other stranger artists, and stranger is the technical term,
Important
legal
term. What Farage would call an immigrant.
Yes, hugely important term. So at this
called
period, a stranger is someone from outside England coming into England. A foreigner is merely someone moving between parishes within England. So in that sense, Shakespeare is a foreigner in London because he was still paying his taxes in Stratford, which also means that's one of the reasons why he lives with the strangers on the other side of the river.
And is summoned to witness.
And is summoned to witness a court case between two stranger families who are arguing about whether their son and daughter should be allowed to marry each other. So, two households,
Where are they
both
from,
apart.
these strangers?
They are also Flemish.
Yeah.
There's a huge incoming crowd of Flemish refugees around this time.
How multicultural is London at this period? Because there's a huge pushback from the right whenever you see a black actor being given a part at the Globe, and they say that this is woke interpretations of Elizabethan England, that England was all white until the 19th century. That's not true.
That isn't true. England in general and London's population particularly increases exponentially throughout the Tudor period. So
Give the figures because they're remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, if you start off around the beginning of Henry VII's reign, his coronation, around that time, you have around 35,000 people in London, the city of London. By James I's coronation, you have 1.5 million.
Well, that's a massive,
in that same city.
growth.
And in the 1570s and the 1590s, you have this huge onslaught of religious refugees coming into England from the Dutch, the Low Countries, Spanish-occupied Netherlands, essentially. So England's population goes up in huge jumps in those two periods. But they're not the only people. I mean, Lavinia Teerlinck, one of the things that fascinated me was trying to figure out something about the experience of people like her. Where did they settle? What do they do? What kind of food do they have? And one of the things, little flashes of insight crop up. So when the Flemish first arrive and the Dutch arrive in London, one of the things that English innkeepers get very worried about is this new drink called beer. Terrible idea. What's wrong with good old English ale? Yeah. So there are ballads circulating in the streets.
Later, the Dutch bring an even more deadly brew called gin.
Yes.
Which is,
absolutely.
Responsible for many a heartache in the 18th century.
But the ballads are fascinating because they talk about, how English ale keeps you hearty and manly, whereas this new Dutch drink called beer just, makes you put on weight and makes you effeminate and prone to tears.
I often find that. Considerable danger. Now, moving on from that, we get to a far more exotic character who's someone I did know about simply because it was my favourite postcard on sale in the Bodleian. And this is the only known Ottoman eunuch from Great Yarmouth, Hassan Aga, or Samson Rowley, he's called. And he turns up on this postcard with a wonderful turban, rather effeminate-looking face, little nice red robes, little blue skirt.
Yes,
Tell us about
precariously holding onto his chair.
Holding onto his chair.
Hassan Aga is a fascinating character. And again, I said earlier that the thing that really fascinated me is this idea of England that you can almost see forming in front of your eyes throughout this period, the span of 150 years. And it is formulated not simply through people who are coming into the country, but also people who are going out of the country. The first inkling that most people would have about Hassan Aga's existence would be through this wonderful collection of travel accounts printed in the late 1580s by a man called Richard Hakluyt. And this is a three-parter.
Who's a very interesting example of a kind of new job at this period.
Oh, absolutely.
which is a kind of historian of travel writing.
Historian of travel writing who hated traveling himself. Only went to France once for 2 weeks and decided he hated every minute of it.
But is
Came back home, never went out again.
It's present on the 22nd of September 1599 in the Founders' Hall.
He is.
When the East India Company has its very first meeting.
Well, he's commissioned by the East India Company.
As official historian?
As an official advisor. But when Richard Hakluyt prints his principal navigations, voyages and discoveries of the English nation, one of the first letters that he prints for the Middle East section of his collection is a letter by the first English ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, a man called William Harborne, who was trying to negotiate the freedom of some captured English sailors. And he was writing to a man called Hassan Aga, who's the eunuch treasurer of Algiers. And he says in that letter, I would be
Algiers being at this point
a part of the Ottoman Empire and a huge hub.
Yeah.
Absolutely huge hub.
And pulling in captive Europeans.
Yeah, absolutely. So Algiers is a watering hole for Mediterranean trade at this point.
It's sort of Jack Sparrow's sort of pirate haven.
Spoiler alert, Willie. We'll come to Jack Sparrow later. But so Harborne writes to this man, Hassan Aga, and says to him, look, I've been trying to free these English sailors from the ship called the Jesus, haven't been getting anywhere, so my only hope is you and your sense of duty as a Joseph among your exiled brethren. You have to free them. And Hakluyt, the editor, puts in a little note explaining why. And he says, this Hassan Aga was Samson Rowley, the son of a Bristol merchant who was taken in the ship Sparrow. He was captured from this English ship, and as the Ottomans did quite often in those days, he was offered a choice of either being ransomed by his countrymen, and he knew that the likelihood of that happening was fairly low, or converting to Islam and being absorbed within the Ottoman state. And that's what he did. And by this point, he had risen through the rungs to become the treasurer of Algiers. And that's where we get that image of him in his turban clutching the armrests of his chair.
And he represents this very odd paradox in the Ottoman Empire that people who were slaves and forcibly, in his case, presumably forcibly castrated and undergoing horrible privations, are on the fast track for promotion.
Absolutely.
And a great deal of the senior Ottoman bureaucracy is people like him who at various points in their life, some as the Devrishme, harvested as children from the Balkans, some later on seized from their vessels. But these are the guys who are rising most rapidly in imperial service.
Hugely. And the Ottoman court is hugely multicultural in that sense. And that's one of the things that gives them their sense or power of negotiation with these multiple other states across the board. But what is really fascinating about Hassan Aga is how he messes up people's sense of identity. So how do you deal with this particular figure who is born in England, but now swears allegiance to a different ruler? If you think of Englishness as Protestant Englishness, how do you deal with someone who's born in England but practices Islam?
Even worse than being a Catholic.
Yes. There's he really stirs things up in terms of that simple sense of identity that one might want to have, particularly because he's so essential for the English.
And there's a whole literature, isn't there? Nabil Matar's written 4 or 5 books on this,
Yeah.
which highly recommended.
Yeah, absolutely.
Islam in Britain being the first, and then a whole variety of others, about this world of the renegades, which is this world of Brits who get captured by the Ottomans and then often choose not to. There's another case when there's a Captain Hamilton who tries to ransom. He comes with money, trying to ransom a whole variety of these characters.
Yeah,
and they say that they won't come back because they're having a much nicer time on the Mediterranean, surrounded by the joys of Ottoman life.
I mean, that idea of turning Turk is always hovering at the corner of English consciousness. It's a term that's used repeatedly. And then it's not just reused in like political pamphlets or in discussions of policy. It's on the public stage. People are absolutely fascinated by these characters, these Englishmen who go abroad and embrace Islam, embrace other cultures, and all the freedom and the advantages that might come with it.
And most often then disappear from sight once they get absorbed by the Ottoman world. But
yes.
Hassan Aga, we have a few details of his life.
We have a few glimpses, and this is what happens quite often, that when you look at English history through these characters, rather than through the kings and queens and Henry VIII and all of that, you get little bleeps in your long span of history where you get tiny little traces, fragmentary traces. And it is like putting together a jigsaw where multiple pieces might be missing in some ways.
Now, one character who comes into much tighter focus than either our Flemish miniaturist or our Ottoman eunuch is someone that you've been pursuing for a while, in a variety of different incarnations, who is Thomas Stevens, and he represents another major anxiety of the Elizabethan state. Not someone who's turned Turk, but someone who refuses to turn Protestant.
That's right. Yes.
And except he goes a bit further than most.
He goes quite a bit further than most of his contemporaries in many ways. So if Lavina Teerlink is a reminder of how incoming influences from other parts of the world were changing the story of Tudor history or how you thought about the Tudors, and Hassan Aga is a reminder of how trade and other empires were changing the space that England might occupy. Thomas Stevens' story is the story of what happens post-Reformation and post-split from the Catholic Church, and the way in which that puts pressure on what it means to be English, what it means to belong. So if you think about the point before Henry VIII's separation from the Catholic Church, being Christian and being English seems to be a fairly uncomplicated joint package deal in some ways. But post-Reformation, after the split from the Catholic Church, you have this sense of a real crisis looming.
Particularly up here.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the vicinity of York and...
absolutely. Yeah. So York features very much in the chapter on Thomas Stevens for me, because that sense of resistance by the Catholics, by recusants who refuse to follow the processes and the appearances within Protestant Church. You can't move
in Yorkshire but for priest holes and crypto Jesuits. But Thomas Stevens is a real Jesuit.
Thomas Stevens is a real Jesuit. He grows up within a Catholic family in England. He goes to Winchester School, which is where many other prominent Catholic figures in this period have spent their boyhood. When he is a young man, he realizes that staying in England is probably not going to be good for his health. This is the point where Elizabeth...
For longevity.
For longevity. Yeah. Elizabeth I's state has started cracking down on, they're terribly anxious. People like Francis Walsingham are really anxious about bright young things from England going off to the continent in these really tiny, close-knit communities of resistance and then coming back to infiltrate the Protestant English state. So Stevens goes off first to Rome, then to Lisbon, and then as a Jesuit priest, he goes even further. He goes to Western India, to Goa, where the Portuguese had already been for about 80 odd years at this point.
This is the equivalent in Elizabethan terms of sort of Burgess or Maclean or Philby
absolutely.
joining the KGB in the 1950s or 1960s. That this is the worst possible betrayal of the state from the point of view of the intelligence community in London.
Absolutely, and you have that same sense of paranoia growing around people, figures like Edmund Campion at this point. And also the same sense of fascination. You know, there are people who are absolutely fascinated by figures like Campion, who are wonderfully articulate, wonderfully
One of them
charming.
being a certain Guy Fawkes of this parish.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. But Thomas Stevens does not deal with any of that. He goes off to Goa, and in Goa, he learns the local languages, Konkani and Marathi.
Which even today is a bit of an achievement. I mean, there's a number of Brits that speak Konkani or Marathi you could number on probably two hands today, couldn't you?
Particularly given the variations of hard dental sounds in both languages, it is pretty tricky, I think.
I think I know about 4 people that have got Konkani or Marathi of all my Anglo-Indian acquaintance. Lots of people speak Hindi, but Marathi or Konkani is a rare achievement.
They're tricky, and also both of them have enormously rich literary history, which Stevens, to some extent, does familiarize himself with. And we know that because 50 years before John Milton writes what we think of as the first biblical epic by an Englishman, the first biblical epic by an Englishman is actually written in a mixture of Marathi and Konkani by Thomas Stevens and printed at the press in Goa.
When you say a mixture of Marathi and Konkani, is that because Marathi and Konkani haven't sort of formed formal boundaries from each other?
No, it's because he uses certain Konkani terms within a largely Marathi,
is that reflecting
Marathi
local
text.
usage in Goa?
It is. Yeah. And also because he's adopting a particular verse form called the Ovi, which is very much a local folk verse form, but it's adopted into higher Konkani literature.
He's not bastardizing something, he's accurately reflecting the language that's spoken around him.
It is perhaps a little bit more than that. It's not simply an absorption either. What he produces is this wonderful third thing that emerges out of it, which is Marathi, but with an English flavor to it, in the sense that there is a moment very early on in this particular epic poem which goes right from the Old Testament stories into the New Testament. And at the opening of it, a Hindu convert comes to the Padre Guru. Even the name is a portmanteau of those two identities that he holds at this point, and says, look, you've burnt all our religious books.
Certainly the naan bread or the chai tea of its day, Padre Guru.
Yeah. You've burnt all our religious books. What are we going to read? Our young men are going to be up to no good if we don't give them something to read. And the Padre Guru rather irritably says, well, I'm writing something for you, but you've got to be patient because Rome wasn't built in a day. And you have that wonderful moment of that kind of very English sense of irritability emerging under a coconut tree.
I love that. I love that as an example of Englishness to me. But he turns out to be actually a surprisingly useful figure for the British.
Oh, he's fabulously useful. Yeah. He's fabulously useful. Again, we go back to Richard Hakluyt. Remember the man who collected all the letters?
Yeah.
One of the letters that Richard Hakluyt collects is a letter that Thomas Stevens had written to his father back home, singing the praises of the western coast of India. So he talks about the coconut tree and the jasmine flower. He talks about the flying fish in the sea, all kinds of things. And that letter a copy of that letter is carried by the first English ship that is sent to India to suss out whether there might be a possibility of trade at that point, except that you have this bunch of Protestant Englishmen landing in Goa, where the Portuguese had rather diplomatically, shall we say, held off on telling the Mughal emperor about the split in the church at this point. So they're promptly shunted off to jail because it would not do to let people know that the church had been divided.
And Stevens comes to the rescue.
Stevens comes to the rescue. He is one of the people to organize the bail for these people, this small group of English merchants. And
the same
again,
character who would be hung, drawn and quartered if he tried to land in Dover by this point.
Indeed.
Rescues his compatriots.
And again, you have that sense of the messiness of identity, because in each of these reports that those English merchants write back home, they talk of him as an Englishman, the English priest, they say, or the English father.
Is there any
so
sense
what
of,
is that sense
is there
of
any
identity?
Sense in those letters that he's betrayed the country, or is he
Absolutely not.
No. He saved their lives.
I mean, if he changed his mind and said, no, I don't think I'll arrange bail for you today, that would be slightly tricky for them.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So if that isn't exotic enough, we then go even further east, having started in Flanders, then going to the Barbary coast, then to Goa. But that's not the end of it. We even get an Kentish samurai,
Yes.
William Adams, who ends up in Japan.
He does, and this is a story that will probably ring a bell with many here, because it's a story that has been retold. It's been the subject of fascination right from William Adams's own lifetime onwards, really, till very recently.
And is the basis not only of the novel Shogun, but that Netflix series that, if you haven't seen, you should go and watch immediately, because one of the best things on the telly in the last couple of years.
Absolutely. So I was talking earlier about the sense of identity, and Stevens as this Englishman who's both English, but not perhaps an ideal English subject because of his religion. The other problem is with seafaring men, sailors. What happens to your sense of identity, which is so rooted in soil and right of birth and right of soil, when you're out on the high seas, where identities and national boundaries blend into each other? Stevens is an English sailor. He fights in the Armada, is decommissioned after that, like thousands of other English sailors, and has to find a way to earn a living. So he takes up jobs, piecemeal jobs, on various foreign ships. At one point, at the end of the 16th century, he finds himself on a Dutch shipping voyage in a ship called the Liefde. And Liefde gets shipwrecked off the coast of Japan. Again, the Portuguese, like as had happened with the English in Goa, get very worried about these Protestant Dutch sailors coming onto shore. They try to convince the Japanese landlord of that particular area that these are pirates and you shouldn't be dealing with them. Except that Stevens, who's the only one able to actually stand up and string a sentence together by this point, is carted off to the shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Stevens Adams.
William Adams. So he goes off to the shogun's court, and within a few years, he becomes one of the principal advisors of Ieyasu. Ieyasu has just emerged from a really bloody civil war in Japan. He's very keen on absorbing any advantage he can. And here is a man who knows alternative ways of building ships, of piloting. Adams was a pilot, ship's pilot, so he knows how to calculate longitude and latitude. So his knowledge is highly prized.
And
Then
artillery? Is that
artillery is partly, I mean, this is interesting though, in the sense that the
Mughals
ship,
are ahead of the British in all sorts of ways, but well behind in
terms of
gunpowder.
Yeah, gunpowder and firepower. It's the same to some extent in Japan. But the thing that Ieyasu is really interested in is long-haul voyage and shipbuilding. Building of ships that are easily maneuverable in a way that the Japanese long-haul vessels weren't in this period. And Stevens is very good at explaining how the kind of maneuverability of European-style shipbuilding masts work, for instance.
How far does he, I mean, superficially he takes a Japanese wife and a Japanese concubine, and he's wearing Japanese clothes, and he's officially a samurai.
Yes.
But how far does he go across to that culture? Is it a very profound transition, or is he wearing clothes?
He's a mixture of the two, and this is something that you come across time and time again throughout this period. This sense that when you're straddling multiple cultures, it doesn't divide your identity. It multiplies it. It enhances it. So repeatedly, you have people like William Adams, where his countrymen are desperately trying to categorize him in one way or the other. Is he English? Is he not? Whereas people like Adams and Stevens are quite comfortably occupying both identities. So for instance, when the first English voyage arrives in Japan, and they are responding to a letter that Adams had sent back home, they are slightly taken aback by this Englishman who wears Japanese clothes, who has a Japanese family, who very politely refuses their offer to lend him their English chef. Because they think he'd be desperate for English food, and he says very politely, well, I've actually had dinner already. And they're very upset
He's into sushi and teriyaki by this stage.
Yes, well, John Saris, the captain, does not take it well, let me tell you. He grumbles for about 4 pages in his journal, daily journal, about the ungratefulness of Anjin Sama, this new man that Adams has become. But it is really fascinating to see this population that is forming, in a way, scattered around the world, that is forming through movement.
Really. And he doesn't come back. He stays in Japan.
He stays in Japan. He lives to a ripe old age. Both Thomas Stevens in India and William Adams lived into their 70s.
It's interesting. There are, in a sense, two types of these people. There are those who flirt with other masks and will wear Mughal clothes and will take service perhaps in a Raja's court, but end their days in England.
Yeah.
Just like more recent figures like Lawrence Arabia or Patrick Leigh Fermor are actually in the end buried in English soil. Then there are those who really do go the whole hog.
Yeah.
And in a sense, to a certain extent, lose their Englishness into this new identity that they take.
I wonder whether we would call it losing their Englishness, in the sense that Englishness itself is evolving. In this period. By the time we're talking about William Adams, for instance, the whole idea of what it means to be English has come under pressure because you have a Scottish king on the English throne. So that whole idea of what it means to be an English person is being negotiated in the Houses of Parliament, in the legal
But you can contrast it very strongly with another figure that you've written about, Thomas Roe.
Absolutely.
Who is absolutely...
Who's the diametric opposite, yes.
However far he spends anywhere abroad, he does a lot of travelling. He remains stolidly the representation of England abroad.
Oh, absolutely. Thomas Roe, who is the central figure in my earlier book, Courting India, is the first English ambassador sent to the court of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. And he's sent by James I but bankrolled by the East India Company, who are desperate to find what they call a vent or a market for their English wool.
A vent.
A vent. So basically, till this point, till Reformation, you had English wool being, lovely green pastures in England, lovely fluffy white sheep, wool being taken from said sheep, carted off to continental Europe, made into woolen cloth, and dispersed from there. Once you have the separation of the church, multiple markets in continental Europe go, now you'll have to pay an enhanced tax because you're not part of our business community, financial
Tudor Brexit.
community. Tudor Brexit. Yeah. So as one does, you look for alternative markets, and Roe is in charge of finding an alternative market in the global south, which is partly, I suspect, the reason why he swans around wearing English wool in 40 degrees heat in Ajmer.
So that's a very nice segue to our next subject. So in the face of Brexit, the Brits foolishly look for a new alliance with America. And that which brings us to a character I'd never come across. Some of these characters, like William Adams, have had fiction and non-fiction written about them. But Elizabeth Key is a completely new character to me. Tell us about her.
So to understand Elizabeth Key's story, we have to go to Virginia, the English colony in Virginia in the 1630s. In 1636, one particular English plantation owner, a man called Thomas Key, who has earned a fortune in this particular colony growing tobacco, which is their primary export from Virginia back to England. James I doesn't like the idea at all, and neither does Charles, but it's happening anyway. Thomas Key decides to come back home, except that he has to deal with all his property, including his slaves, and including the offspring he has fathered with some of those slaves. And one of them is a 7-year-old girl called Elizabeth. Except that Thomas Key never comes home. He dies before he even sets sail back to Virginia, from Virginia to England. And all the framework of care that he had set around this young girl collapses. The family he had sent her off to be fostered with initially say, well, actually, we took her on as an indentured servant. A few years later, they say, well, actually, it wasn't an indenture, she's a slave. But by the time we come to Elizabeth again, when she's in her 20s, she's married to an English indentured man, a man called William Grinstead, and she has a son of her own, and she has brought a court case at Virginia High Court, and that's being fought over a period of over a year and a half. And her case is a claim for liberty. She argues that if under English common law, the father has a primary claim on his children, and also under English common law, slavery is not a word that can survive in the free air of England, then as the daughter of a free-born Protestant Englishman, she cannot be enslaved, and neither can her children. And this court case rolls on and on and on for ages, for months.
Which is terrific for historians, but not for Elizabeth.
Absolutely not for Elizabeth. And it's tortuous, really. Multiple witnesses are called, and ultimately, Virginia High Court has to agree that she's right. Or rather, William Grinstead, who's arguing her case for her, is right, and she has to be freed. And she is, except that you would think it's a happy story, but about 2.5 years later, that door that opens for Elizabeth shuts ever so quietly behind her, when the same High Court says they needed to make a clarification to their laws, when they said that birthright of Englishness belonged to all children of English parentage, and the parentage that counted was that of the father, it applied to everyone except to those born of African enslaved mothers. In that case, it was maternal bloodline that counted. So if you were the child of an enslaved African woman, you were going to be a slave, and so were subsequent generations.
So a surprising number of the transcultural stories in your book have quite happy endings. I mean, it looks as if both Stevens and Adams have found worlds that they fit into
Mm-hmm.
and enjoy being in and choose to be in when they could reverse if they wanted to. But you have one very dark story, which is Rodrigo Lopez. Tell us that story.
Rodrigo Lopez's story takes us back a little bit, again, back to the 1580s, to Elizabeth I's court. Lopez is the celebrity doctor of this period. He's a Jewish doctor who converted to...
Converso.
A converso.
Of Jewish heritage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, his family converts to Catholicism first, and then they to Protestantism, and he moves to England.
So in many ways, the model immigrant.
He is absolutely the very picture of a good immigrant. He's multicultural, multilingual. He has connections all over continental Europe. He's highly educated. And very, very willing to do service to his new country. And so he does. He is the chosen doctor of choice for everyone who's anyone at court for a span of over a decade. And then we have the rise of the Earl of Essex. So at this point, Elizabeth is getting on in age. There's a great deal of anxiety about her health, her welfare. The old guard at the Tudor court, at Elizabethan court, are beginning to die. And there's a new guard, at the head of whom is the Earl of Essex, who's very much keen on establishing his power at court. And he decides that the best way of doing that is by showing that Elizabeth's safety depends on his watchfulness. And so a scandal breaks at court that apparently there's an assassination plot that Essex has been able to crack, only Essex has been able to crack, and at the heart of it is Rodrigo Lopez, this immigrant doctor who apparently had taken bribe from the Spanish and the Portuguese and was going to poison the Queen.
And is this, in retrospect, a pure case of anti-Semitism?
There is a great deal of anti-Semitism that is running throughout this period. So one of the things that, for instance, bursts out in the public scene, roughly around the same time as the scandal, is a restaging of a play by Christopher Marlowe called The Jew of Malta, where, again, the leading character is a vengeful Jew who poisons the well in the city. So Essex's story is picking up on all those anxieties that were simmering under the surface and absolutely pointing it with laser-sharp focus onto the single person. And Lopez is taken to the tower. He's interrogated by Essex himself at one point. He confesses to the crime under interrogation, retracts it later on, but
Interrogation being the rack, or
being stretching, where you're kind of put out on the rack and then stretched in all four directions at the same time. He is then, Elizabeth ultimately hums and haws, very typically for Elizabeth, for ages, and then ultimately sentences him to death. Except that we know that she probably wasn't fully convinced, even at that point, of his guilt, because she returns his estate to his English wife and their children, which is unheard of. If you were accused of treason, you did not get your property returned to you by the state.
So this is the same Elizabeth who has Mary Queen of Scots executed, but is guilty enough for that, that James is adopted and so on. So it's the same sort of shifty behaviour by Elizabeth
Yes,
guilty.
Elizabeth is
Yeah.
always torn between that sense of, what may be right or wrong and what is good for the state.
State. And
that sense.
advised by Walsingham always goes for the latter.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how should we look at this period? It's not a multicultural paradise, but there's a lot more global and continental influence than we have been led to believe.
Yes, there is. And it certainly isn't a multicultural paradise. One of the risks of looking at this particular age through any kind of particular focus is that you privilege one view over the other, except that we know, if we look at the world around us, that the world and our views tend to be complicated and messy. The same person who might be best friends with the stranger who's their neighbor, the person who buys him a drink at the birth of his son or stands as a witness in a legal case for him, may also be the person who then grumbles about these stranger apprentices coming and taking the jobs of English apprentices and singing those ballads on the streets.
And this, in a sense, is something which Englishness retains right through to the present, with this double edge of being both an island, but an island which is surrounded by seas which pulls you outwards to... So while we're an island nation, very rooted in our land, we're also forced by circumstance to travel, and by travel encounter the world beyond.
Absolutely, and it's not simply a responsive kind of knee-jerk reaction. I think one of the things that I try to show in this book is that the whole idea of Englishness does not get formed in this period despite the presence of the stranger. It gets formed in conversation with that idea of both the stranger in your midst, but also the experience of being a stranger.
And Shakespeare has both that, isn't it? It's very rooted in England, and yet there is so much that is Italian or that is Jewish or that is of the Caribbean and exotic magical islands. And,
there's a well, Shakespeare. You talked about Shakespeare. One of the earliest plays he writes, The Comedy of Errors, is the story of a man arriving in a country where strangers of particular other countries are not allowed under the threat of death, and then realizing at the final moment that the person he meets, the person who blames him for taking over his house, his land, his wife, is his twin brother. That they're not so different after all. And at the same time as Shakespeare's theatre company was performing this particular play on the stage at Gray's Inn in London, among all the up-and-coming, rising, bright young lawyers of the land, in the Houses of Parliament, just around the corner, Walter Raleigh was in debate, in an immigration debate, the 1590s immigration debate, where Raleigh is of the group who are saying that we need to stamp down on strangers coming into our country. Raleigh famously, and Raleigh
would be for reform, would he?
He would, absolutely. Yeah. Famously, he says, these are people who come here and take our resources. Also, I mean, what
this
he
is a bit
was...
rich coming from Raleigh, who's been taking the resources of Latin America.
Well, that's what he wants, though. I mean, his argument is that those resources, wouldn't it be just better if the Queen gave me those resources so that I could go and find El Dorado in the New World instead? And at the same time, you have other MPs in Parliament who are saying, but remember the old days when we were exiles under Queen Mary in continental Europe. Remember how quickly the tables can turn, and how can we then shut our doors in the face of others?
Very nice. Ladies and gentlemen, please a big round of applause for Nandini.
Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, if anyone would like to ask any. So, I think there's a mic coming down. Sorry, we're making you run around.
Thank you very much. You mentioned a huge rise in the population of Henry VII to James I. Have we any idea what percentage of that population were strangers? Is there any way of gauging that?
You can get a rough idea around periods of census. So there are intermittent kind of moments throughout this period when the monarch could order a kind of a register of strangers to be taken. And in fact, that's one of the reasons we get all these records about Rodrigo Lopez, because a census is taken of all the strangers in particular neighborhoods in London. So you can get a rough idea of the rise in numbers. You have roughly around 10 to 12%, and then you have sudden peaks. But the thing is that that number rises and falls. So in the 1570s, for instance, you have a great influx from continental Europe of Protestant exiles who come to England, and most of them gravitate towards London. Some gravitate towards other major cities like Norwich, for instance. And then if you take the next census of strangers, about 12 years later, many of them have dispersed. Some of them have gone back to continental Europe. So that number keeps rising and falling throughout this period.
Hi. Your examples were of English who went to other countries, whether it was the Ottoman Empire or Goa or Japan. Are there examples in this time of the influx of strangers who then became English? So I'm an Indo-Caribbean person who has a lot of problems with V.S. Naipaul, who I think did that in the 20th century. You know, took his Indo-Trinidadian self, came to England, became more British than anything else.
Did he become more Brahmin?
Brahmin, British, we could talk a lot about that. See me after the show. But are there examples in this period of that influx of people?
There's fragmentary records of numerous figures like that. There's some wonderful, wonderful work by the late Imtiaz Habib, who was an amazing historian particularly of Black lives in Tudor archives. And he trawled through parish court cases, petitions, legal records, and you get little fragments. Quite often, those fragments are very difficult to follow up because all we have are those little flickers when certain lives cross maybe legal frameworks or political frameworks in some ways. But just off the top of my head, for instance, one figure who I was very fascinated by is a man called Samuel Mansour, who comes from Bengal in eastern India. And we know about Samuel Mansour because he petitions the East India Company that he wants to take back his English wife, Jane, to India when he goes back, and that petition is denied. So we don't know what happens to Jane, or indeed to Samuel, whether he goes back without his wife. There is another person.
What date is he?
He is 1596,
Very early.
I think, yeah.
This is pre-East India Company.
It's just before, it's after the first exploratory voyage, which is 1583.
And has he come back with that voyage?
No, he comes back. There's a huge influx of Gujarati sailors who are on various ships in Red Sea and Mediterranean trade at this point.
But how does the Bengali get to England?
If you look at particular ships' rosters in the port books of of various major ports, Portsmouth, Southampton, you have multiple descriptions, entries for sailors, quite often who are described as Indian. But they may well have come from various parts of India or West Africa. Japan, we know about 2 Japanese boys, Christopher and Cosmos, who also arrive in England in the late 16th century. There are women. There's one particular woman called Mariam Khan, who is an Armenian Christian.
Who Jahangir gives to Hawkins.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
So she's fostered, she grows up at the Mughal court of the Emperor Jahangir, and the emperor marries her off to William Hawkins, who is a adventurer, really, a chancer, vaguely employed by the East India Company.
And a big drinker.
And a big drinker, gets into trouble, and has to escape from the Mughal court precisely because of that. But Mariam comes back to England. Hawkins dies, she remarries very quickly, for safety, one would suspect, because Hawkins dies on shipboard, and a long-haul ship is not a safe place for a solitary woman in this period. So she marries the ship's captain, a man called Gabriel Towson. So you have little fragments. That's a very long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you so much. It's been really fascinating to hear you talk through the characters in the book. I've always found it fascinating how you find the information. Where is this? Where are these archives? Is this like, you're putting the gloves on in the British Library? Or you talked about ports. Are you actually having to go to ports and archive? Anything about how you actually find this information would be fantastic to know. Thank you.
The sources are scattered all over the place. I mean, a principal source are the East India Company papers, which are
Gloves on in the British Library.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, gloves not on, actually. I mean, this is one of my favorite bugbears. You've started me on this now. Documentaries always, whenever I kind of film anything, people insist that you put gloves on, and then I have to explain, no, you don't do that, because that's terrible for old paper that will crumble if you don't feel, if you can't touch and feel how fragile it is. Gloves just merely look good. But please don't put gloves on when you go to archives. Just treat the paper carefully.
I've heard you make this speech before.
Haven't you just? But you see that you've touched a sore point there. But to come back to your question, there's a huge amount of material. So I talked about petitions earlier. Legal records are great for this kind of thing. You have huge amounts of legal records, both in court cases, but also in terms of wills, for instance. Wills are a great way of finding things out.
Once the East India Company gets going, there is a law that every company official has to make a will.
Yeah.
And because the company gets into so many law cases, a copy is sent to England, and every one of those survive in the British Library.
Yeah,
you can get these
absolutely.
enormous ledgers down. And in wills, people tend to tell the truth about particularly their love affairs, because they want to leave money to kids or to girlfriends.
And also
so
about objects. You can
Lovely.
trace people through the way objects pass through. But the other important sources are letters. As when I was talking about Thomas Stevens and William Adams, I mentioned letters. And letters give you wonderful glimpses of voices of these particular people. The other thing that I found immensely useful quite often are records. The thing that I mentioned earlier in answer to a previous question, strangers' books, or what used to be called the Register of Aliens, which has a strange sci-fi ring to it. But the Register of Aliens recorded every foreigner and foreign household within London, including the permanent and visiting people. So you get little glimpses of family units through those.
Some portraits too. The Moroccan ambassador looking very dashingly.
Yeah, yeah.
handsome.
But portraits are so few and far between. One of my greatest a find that I really loved was this little pen image that a man with the fantastic name of Stephen Batman sketched in a manuscript he was putting together, and it's of a little African girl holding a bunch of flowers that he paints as a frontispiece, but it's so incredibly alive that you cannot but think that perhaps this was sketched from life. And we know that Batman lived right on the border of a neighborhood where there was a lot of immigrant presence. So there are little kind of inklings of that scattered across manuscripts. And you mentioned the image of Hassan Aga, which actually appears in a friendship book. You know those little notebooks that people have when in school where friends write little messages for you? Well, the Tudors used to do that too. They were called Alba Amicorum, literally friendship books. And this is in a German friendship book where someone had sketched a picture of Hassan Aga.
It looks like that. So I think Nandini will sign books. Some of mine out there too, if anyone wants to know those. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.